Story explained, we covered how in America there was a sudden need to build asylums in the 18th and 19th centuries. The size and population count during these times make these structures very questionable, some of them almost being self-contained cities. The narrative is that these were built because there was a rise in sickness and lunatics, and they say this is due to the Civil War and yellow fever. As we covered, this narrative doesn't really make sense, and it's much more likely that these were old world buildings built by a prior civilization that were then turned into reset programming facilities by the inheritors. Now, this video could have been part of the last video because in a way this is a direct continuation of that subject, but I think it's better that we go ahead and do two different videos. It started to become apparent after the research for the last video that many of these asylums have another name. You know how at the very early history of many of these mental institutions, some of them actually started as prisons that had flooded with many who were mentally ill, and eventually the inmates were told to build their own hospital. At least that's how the story goes. But the point is that at some point, these prisons and mental institutions were essentially one. And the same could be said for the orphanages. Many of these asylums were also orphan homes. They have different names for them. Sometimes they call it orphan asylums, foundling hospitals, and oddfellow homes. This is where the story gets even deeper. These homes were funded and owned by a Masonic lodge known as the Oddfellows. These people play a major role in the reset program during the early 1800s, and it was done under the name of philanthropy, but if you look at some of their symbols and the people behind this, we can begin to suspect that maybe their intentions weren't so benign. Interestingly, this was brought up when we looked into Spring Grove in Maryland. Many of these hospitals were funded by this organization. The Independent Order of Oddfellows, IOOF, is a non-political and non-sectarian international fraternal order of odd fellowship. It was founded in 1819 by Thomas Wilde in Baltimore, Maryland, United States, but it evolved from the Order of Oddfellows, founded in England during the 1700s. I don't know, that just kind of seems weird to me, but these people and their whole mission was to educate the orphans. Okay, so let's take a look at some of these Oddfellow buildings. These are essentially orphanages, and they have lodges as well. And it's the same thing. It's the same constant theme that you see with some of these other asylums. Basically castles. Right? And who are these people? There's another castle. Who are these Oddfellows with all these symbols, and they have these nice suits and they're all prepared in these cities? But who are these Oddfellows? They're basically a secret order. And I saw this cool website that basically was an artwork done with all their symbols and some prominent Oddfellows and Freemasons. But this is basically another order that is associated with these asylums and orphanages. So if we come down, he was listing some of the people in here. You have the vice president. You have the president in here. You have Albert Pike. So who were these people, and why, do we not hear about them as much as the Freemasons, right? And I find it strange that they try to say that they're all for friendship, love, and truth, right? As if this is just some charitable organization. But then, you come and you look at some of their symbols. I mean, what's going on? We have the eye, we have the fasces. These are all occult symbols. And so we even have Rosicrucian or Catholic type symbols and Masonic artwork. Masonic with the 3 links. So that's the Oddfellow connection. They're connected with the Masons. And Skull and Bones. So these people are the ones funding many of these hospitals, and they have buildings all around the world. Oddfellow halls, they have lodges, They have cemeteries. So this is a big deal. Here's a Oddfellow Mansion in Denmark. They're in Australia. Let's keep scrolling down. Here's some in Toronto that look pretty. There's that Denmark one. And then you have some of these smaller ones, but even these, I mean, these are still old world buildings. You know, we might think like these are pretty easy to build, and I mean, they probably are nowadays, but still, I mean, you know, the inheritors weren't going to waste time. They just took over some of these buildings that were already here. So here's some, and there's some bigger ones down here. Here's an Oddfellow Hall. Pretty impressive looking. Let's see this one, St. Charles. And so, yeah, I mean, this is obviously a very, very wealthy organization to own all these buildings or have all these constructed as they tell us. So, and all these lodges too, they look very old world. And then they have cemeteries, so very strange indeed. The Oddfellows, also known as the Three Link Fraternity, is one of the oldest and largest non-political and non-sectarian fraternal and service-oriented organizations in the world. Now, if you think this is just some white person thing or this operation was done solely by one race, you're mistaken, as many of these Oddfellow organizations were also entirely black. We will come back to this when we get to the colored orphanages. Essentially, at this time, there was no healthcare, no orphanages, no care for the elderly, so this group called the Order of Oddfellows comes out of nowhere. There are many theories about how it first started and got its name, but its generally accepted belief is that it emerged in England when a group of working class men who fell outside of the established system of trade guilds banded together to form their own labor association. So they continue, and this is what they tell us, that at the time of industrialization in England, fellows from various odd trades gathered together and formed a fraternity to protect and care for their members and communities at a time when there was no welfare state, trade unions, and national health insurance. Honestly, I think it's complete BS because, as we'll see shortly, these people had a lot of money and were not such an average working class guys as we're led to believe. It could also be that at some point the state took over because there's no way that this was just started by a few laborers. But of course, they give us this story. They would work together to help each other and the unfortunate families back on their feet, whether it was rebuilding a barn that had burned or putting in a new crop after a devastating season. Such helpers came to be known as Oddfellows, so named by general population who thought they were an odd bunch of fellows who would behave in such a selfless and seemingly impractical fashion. Then, the group adopted the name. This is a pretty funny way to get their name, but you know, these are the stories that they tell us. And as many of you know, many of these controllers think they're clever by working under philanthropy, as the order's triple link symbol is alluding to its motto, friendship, love, and truth, which sounds pretty fake to me. By the early 1700s, there were a number of Oddfellows organizations in England. In 1810, various Oddfellow lodges of the London Union Order in Manchester organized an independent order of Oddfellows with the title Manchester Unity. With their improved system, they were able to persuade other Oddfellow lodges to join their unity. They also chartered the Independent Order of Oddfellows in America years after. Okay, so it started in England, and at some point, through Thomas Wilde, he immigrates into Maryland and then decides to get Oddfellows started in America. Because at this time, for whatever reason, according to the narrative, there was no health insurance and there was no one there to take care of all the people. So, you know, they decide that they're going to go build all these massive asylums and orphanages and spend all this money to make it super detailed and ornate. And let's break all other architectural goals ever made in America. And let's go ahead and make it a self-contained city. And you know what? We're going to do all of this for free. That's basically the abridged version, okay? So do you believe that? So who is this Thomas Wilde? Wilde was born in London, England in 1782. He was left an orphan 5 years later, and the IOOF pledge to educate the orphans sprang from his personal childhood experiences. See, so what you have is these orphans guiding other orphans, and this kind of reminds me a lot of the Promised Neverland, which We should definitely do a breakdown in the future, but essentially, this process had already begun by this point. At the age of 14, Wildy went to live with an uncle. After he had 9 years of schooling, he became an apprentice to a maker of coach springs. He joined the British Oddfellows in 1804. Right, so they train a child to join this fraternity, and if you're the right choice, you continue the cycle. So when Wildy immigrated to America in 1817, the British were still unpopular in the States because of the War of 1812. And that year, Baltimore was suffering both from yellow fever epidemic and mass unemployment. I find it weird that they feel the need to bring this up again. It's like all these organizations and structures are being founded during this 1812 time, and so they even admit that this outside organization infiltrating Maryland is basically unpopular. Are the Oddfellows some type of British fraternity that was started in the early 1700s to facilitate the process of putting orphans through reset programming? So he comes to America, puts out an advertisement, and on April 26, 1819, 4 men who responded to the advertisement formed the Independent Order of Oddfellows in North America, dedicating the order to achieve philanthropic goals. Other Englishmen who were Oddfellows had grouped in the states along the eastern seaboard, and Wildy gathered them all into the newly formed fraternity. He traveled widely to set up lodges in the most recently settled parts of the country. Now, it's not just that they bought these buildings, because that's one link that we have to this fraternity, but it's much harder to find what are the institutions that may have been funded by this very same fraternity, such as the asylums and colleges. See, when they say philanthropy, it really means they are capitalizing on their means of control and power. I just have a hard time believing that this random guy named Thomas came to America and just started one of the largest organizations to this day, and how did he get so wealthy if he was an orphan? These 5 people were responsible for funding many of these Oddfellow homes during this period, and they did so for free. I didn't really mention this earlier, but if you look at some of the symbols on the buildings, you can see royal Phoenician family symbology. This isn't just something that started from a small guild. This is another aspect that we need to understand, is that in the modern day, this has become mainstreamed like other groups similar to the Freemasons. Anyone can join nowadays, and they say it's just for love, and oh, this is just a fascies, and it means we need to stick together. You know, they make it sound all innocent because they probably really don't know.
We're definitely very like one of those like American secret societies that you hear about from the Gilded Age.
Oh, I am in, and to our surprise, their headquarters is in downtown Tuscola. The group sounds like something out of a movie, really.
They're called the Oddfellows, and their goal is to give back to their community. WCIA3's Jessica Coons is here. Jessica, the Oddfellows have been around, it sounds like, for a long time.
Paul, they celebrate their 200th birthday in the U.S. next year, and while we're calling them a secret society, they actually do want you to know who they are, because they're working to make a difference. Up a steep staircase in downtown Tuscola, Oddfellows enter their secret meeting space.
Who goes there?
And this is where we give the password. That password gets you into this cavernous room. Ainsley Heilich and his business partner bought the building 7 years ago, and when they walked into this space, they didn't know what to think. Then they found out it used to house an Oddfellows lodge dating all the way back to 1865.
We found all this great old regalia that was just hidden up in the crawl space, almost like national treasure. It's like you start down a path of like little breadcrumbs, and it just kind of ropes you in further and further, and here we are.
With 55 lodges in Illinois alone. Heilich brought back Tuscola's order 3 years ago. They focus on charity work. He says people crave being part of something bigger.
For a lot of people of my generation, we were raised on the internet, and we are seeking that in-person interaction, and we're definitely growing tired of, you know, all the arguing on Facebook.
He says this room is a safe haven for people looking for more out of life.
When you come to a lodge, you leave all that behind you. You can't talk about religion, you can't talk about politics. All you're allowed to do is focus on doing the good of the order and being good friends to each other.
That's what brought Natasha Gardewine here almost a year ago.
Like, I was kind of looking for like a group of people, you know, to kind of, we have similar interests and stuff. So I got here and I was really impressed with it because of the group of artists, and it kind of felt like somewhere that I could fit in.
She encourages others to join too, if not for the friends alone, but being part of a secret society is pretty cool too.
So I was looking through photos and I noticed that there was this ritual that involved riding some kind of goat. And so there's a couple books that actually came out talking about different signs and secret passwords and stuff. So, I mean, this is not just some, you know, love and truth organization. Obviously, there's something going on. But in 1845, a supposed expelled and anonymous Odd Fellow published a book called Odd Fellowship Exposed, where the writer described a horrific and probably inaccurate initiation ceremony, and in the ceremony, a voice cries, "Prepare the goat," when a large black and white goat steps into the hall and the new initiate is told to mount it. After doing this and grabbing the animal's large horns, the new initiate is thrown from the goat and lands on the floor on his back, hearing laughter all around. So, pretty strange. And then there's another book that confirms it too, so it's not just this book. And it makes you wonder, you know, why don't they talk about these odd fellows doing rituals or being very symbolic? Like, why is that not explained when we kind of look up the wiki page or just a basic explanation of these people? And I also saw that there was this book that kind of explained the symbols a little bit more, and it's, I mean, this could be its own video, but it's very religious. It obviously seems kind of associated with something much older. This is not just some laborers who came up with all this stuff. And so, yeah, I just thought it was kind of weird that they don't really bring this up. I can't help but wonder why they went so far to make it a ritual or symbolical at all. This is just a private men's club, right? If you want to talk about philosophy, then do so, but I think it's more likely that our modern day Oddfellow lodges and groups are the remnants of a secret occult fraternity that was connected to the royal monarchy. They most likely have moved into other organizations, or only the highest ranking members truly know the history of these lodges. Look into it. These Oddfellow Masons try to make it seem like they just talk about life and working as a team and stuff, but if we look at these old photos of these Oddfellows, I think it was something else back then. Look at some of these pictures. I mean, the whole city is in on it. It's almost as if this is some type of orphanage society that groomed the orphans into controlling the next batch of orphans, possibly by giving them some knowledge of the old world. So I saw this when I was looking through Google, and I saw these kind of like illustrations, and I was like, huh, that kind of looks Tartarian, because I know I've seen these types of engravings and pictures in other books where they are like depicting Tartarians and they look just like this. And supposedly this is Oddfellow costumes. And at first I was like not really sure if it actually was the same thing, but I think it is. Here's the Skull and Bones thing. Here are some real Oddfellows, and this is basically like there's different levels. Here's a book talking about it. Let's see. The Warden, the First Degree. I click on this. So, I think this is something to consider. I don't know 100% how to kind of add this in, but I thought it was weird because it does remind me of some of those Tartarian depictions that we've seen. Not only are they connected with most of the local city institutions, but also the colleges. So if they didn't build all these structures, then what's going on? Well, first we need to take a look at ghost or reset cities. There are many photographs from the 1800s that should show heavily populated cities that seem to be completely empty. It's almost as if it's a total ghost town. what if the majority of these cities were already here, and then some event occurred that wiped large parts of the cities away? A lot of downtown areas are likely the result of this cataclysm. Many of the buildings not only have underground sections, but are only old brick up to a certain point before they are reconstructed with new materials. This would imply that the tops of these buildings were destroyed at some point, and it's more than just a few buildings that could have suffered a random fire. It's dozens, maybe even hundreds in nearly every city. The idea that this is a natural, cyclical reset is just as plausible as the idea that our very idea of nature is being manipulated by other humans for the sole purpose of mitigating human populations under the guise of acts of God or weather phenomena. Phenomena, a fact or situation that is observed to exist or happen, especially one whose cause or explanation is in question. A group of inheritors then came in and began the process of using these buildings for their own population. They'd empty out a city and then move in a completely new batch of people. There'd be orphans who knew nothing of their history or the last world. Anyone who knew or didn't follow instructions would be put in the asylum. The way I see it is that the whole War of 1812 has to do with there still being some surviving populations in the US and their attempt to fight off the invaders. There must have been some type of hijacking during this point, and one of the means of doing so was asylums, colleges, and repopulating cities. We have all these fire events occurring during this time, and these are huge fires, and it may be that this is connected to when a city gets hijacked and prepared for repopulation. So let's take a look at some old photos of San Francisco, and they're pretty good quality. It's basically a panorama, and these photos were taken in the 1870s. So according to the history of San Francisco, it was founded by Spain in November of 1769, but it was still a small settlement with, quote, inhospitable geography. So in 1850, there was still no real city yet, and it wasn't until the gold rush that people started moving into these areas in the West, as the story goes. And so the population during this time is supposed to be around 150,000, and let's keep in mind that this is only because of an odd boost in the amount of people in the 1870s, 20 years after the gold rush. It has the largest population increase if we don't include the initial population growth of the first decade. To me, this city does not look like a city of 150,000, but a city of more than 1 million. But where is everybody? There's not a soul to be seen, and one of the common explanations for this is that these were architectural photos commissioned by the owner of the buildings themselves, and so they didn't want busy streets, and it just doesn't really seem like that's the full story, as you would think there would be someone, at least some horses or children walking around. I mean, even on a Sunday, you would see people going out to church, so it's just very strange that we don't see anyone in these photos. It's not just the photos that make San Francisco suspect, but the world fairs that were built and destroyed within a span of 20 years, and this is also home to the largest earthquakes and fires known in US history. Or at least, that's what they tell us, as this seems to be a common theme with almost every city. It's also strange that there was this great flood in 1862 that sank the entire city of Sacramento and left a small island sea in Orange County that lasted for 3 weeks. Seems like a lot of things were happening back then in California. This may have been one of the great events that transformed California's appearance, as it was literally thought to be an island just less than 100 years prior, but no, that's just a cartographic error. Let's move on to Chicago. And I think I need to mention is that some people might need to see literally the exact same scenario as San Francisco with these like HD photos and all this stuff, but it's not always that simple, as it's very difficult to find photos of major cities before 1870, which, if you ask me, doesn't really make that much sense. Why does California have professional panoramic photos of their city in 1870s, but we don't see anything like that for Chicago or New York? If so, it has been purposefully hidden. So basically, Chicago was started in the 1830s, and there's a lot of weird stuff going on with Chicago. Like, the entire city was lifted up by a couple feet, and this was all done by private property owners with jacks, and they were lifting these huge buildings up off the ground because there was flooding due to these nearby swamplands, and I don't really buy that story at all. But on top of that, they tell us that there was this huge fire in 1870. This here is our key, as we have nothing else to go on. This is when Chicago became a ghost city and cleared out. We do have a few photos of what this looked like, and let me ask you, does this really look like just a simple fire? They literally tell us that this is the Great Fire that did all this damage because a cow kicked over a lantern and set fire to a barn, right? So even the photos in the early 1900s look kind of weird and empty, and don't get me wrong, you can find photos of Chicago populated in the 1900s, but it's like 1906, 1910. This is after the city was repopulated. Before 1870s, you will not see densely populated city photos, which is strange because they completely possess the ability to take these photos, so why didn't they? It also wasn't just dependent on long exposure capture either, as other methods were already being developed, such as Thomson's revolver camera of 1862. The revolver photographique was patented in 1862 and made by a Parisian instrument maker A. Briois. The camera made 4 exposures on a circular glass plate, with the lens being held in the barrel of the gun. This allowed the photographer to aim and steady the camera with one hand, using the other hand to operate the controls. There is no excuse, the technology was there. Why don't we have more clear photos? It's looking as if they've been systematically removed. Now, New York was one of the first cities to be reset in America, as it was possibly one of the largest settlements of the Tartarians at the time. The city was most likely taken over right before the early 1800s. If we look at how it was depicted in the 1870s, we can see that it should be almost overpacked at this point, and even some of the engravings at this time show it to be very dense streets, but when we look at photos from around the 1870s time period, we really don't see that much on the streets. Yes, if you look at the 1900s photos, you'll see lots of people, but if you look just a little bit earlier, there are many photos shot during the day that show streets completely empty. And I do think that there were people here at this time, probably not as much as they tell us, but just look at all these buildings. You would think buildings this large, we would see way more people on the streets. In New York, there's another Great Fire that was forgotten that occurred in 1776 that destroyed almost 1,000 structures. This fire isn't really well known, but again, you see this in every city as it's a part of the reset process. They must clear these cities out before moving in a new population, and one of the excuses is fires. I found this interesting though. So according to the official history, George Washington and the Revolutionary Army had realized that the British would capture New York City, so they decided to just set fire to everything so that they would gain little from it. Now at first I thought, maybe that's a cover story, but what if there's actually something to that? It would explain why it took the inheritors until the early 1900s to repopulate New York and some of these other cities, as the Tartarians realized that they were going to lose the city and decided it was best to move west and set the cities on fire before the War of 1812. I think it's not too much of a stretch to think that when we see a revolution around this time period, there's some kind of battle going on between the new rulers and the remaining survivors of the old world. I should also mention that there was a lot of compositing going on in these early 1900 photos, which makes a lot of this even more suspicious, but even in some of the most iconic photographs, I believe these to be composites. They did the same thing for construction photos and for adding crowds in. But why would they do this? Well, the main explanation would most likely be for getting these architectural photos, and they would do a certain cleanup process in post, but I don't think that most people are thinking about that when they look at some of these older photos. They 100% had the ability to manipulate and mix photos during this time, so this isn't some crazy concept. But we can still see that something's off with the official narrative, because we should see more people and more photos going back into the 1870s. And even the photos that we do have from the 1890s and 1900s look to be very low population. Some of these photos are very ghostly, and I showed you that we would have the capabilities of shooting HD photos in the 1870s with California, yet the photos we have of New York are mostly from the 1890s and above, and the earliest ones are very, very low quality. So there's no doubt that Philly is an old world American city, but let's just think about this. So Philadelphia is started in the early 1700s, and luckily we have some of the earliest engravings of Philly that most likely are old world engravings which show a hidden truth to the size of Philly during this time. So this is 200 years before the 1900s, yet if we look at some of these photos of Philly, it really doesn't seem as populated as it should be. Now, we do have photos of Philly in the 1840s, and it's a small view. Most of these have a small view, but no one really seems to be in these photos. Kind of weird that there are no people to be seen, no horses. And we also have to realize that the photos that we have from most of these cities in the 1850s belong to private collections. The vast majority have been selected for approval, and I've looked through this entire Frederick de Boer collection of Philadelphia, and all of them are completely empty streets. They have these very narrow angles, and it just seems very, very empty. When it comes to Baltimore, there are very few pictures before 1870. Again, that doesn't really make sense, and one of the earliest photos is just some random photo of a market. We have photos from the 1900s, and even then it seems that the city was not that densely populated. With structures like this, tell me, where are all the people at? It seems by 1910 they finally started to get the streets busy. This is supposed to be Baltimore in 1870. So why is it that there are such few photos, and the ones that we do have, there's only a couple people in them? And I could continue to do this for other cities in America such as Louisville, Atlanta, Detroit, and many others, but this isn't something constrained just to the United States. In Toronto, it's completely empty. How could it possibly be this empty? Venice. Where are the people? They're all missing. Moscow. There's obviously something that they're not telling us, and there's a truth that's been hidden in these cities because it makes no sense to have such huge architectures if these cities have empty streets in the early 1900s. I mean, what are they keeping from us? And why are all the streets in these pictures made of dirt? I mean, you spend all this time building beautiful architecture just to have horrible dirt roads? Nah, they didn't build these cities. These were inherited by different peoples, and then they were cleared out. This brings us to the next step in the reset process, which was the trafficking of orphans into new reset cities. Parents would give up rights to children for multiple months so that the asylum would prevent them from learning bad habits. This was a huge thing back then, where you have these orphan homes and asylums that essentially were one and raised children of the new world. I wonder if many of these families found themselves in positions where they were forced to send their children at some point. From Alone in the World, Orphans and Orphanages in America by Catherine Reef, quote, "Through much of the 19th century, orphanages broke families apart. A parent placing a child in asylum usually was forced to give up all rights to him or her. Many asylum managers believed that separating children from their parents once and for all was in the children's best interest. They knew of no better way to prevent the children from learning bad habits like drunkenness and laziness that might lead them into poverty. Throughout the United States, destitute parents agreed in writing not to interfere in the raising of their sons and daughters. This was a very hard step to take. These parents knew they would never again comfort their children in sickness. They would never again watch their children play or share their joy. They were to have no say in what their children learned in school, how they were taught to worship, or how they were disciplined. Many mothers and fathers, unable to read or write, signed away their parental rights by making a mark on a printed surrender form. It sounds like they were tricked into giving their children away, but she continues to say, quote, "Asylums had an especially high death rate because contagious diseases spread rapidly when many children lived together. In 1849, 20 children died at the Colored Orphan Asylum in New York City, 9 of them from cholera. In 1840, the managers of the Washington City Orphan Asylum were pleased to report, quote, "Within the last 12 months, the withering hand of sickness has barely touched the inmates of the orphan's home. One infant spirit had been translated to a brighter world. Quote, 1 or 2 deaths in a year was a statistic worthy of pride." Cruel living conditions in many asylums promoted the spread of disease. It was not unusual in the first half of the 19th century for orphans to sleep 3 or 4 to a bed. They bathed rarely and wore grimy, stained clothes, giving asylums the sour, poor house smell that anyone who worked among the needy knew all too well. In 1859, when 4 Roman Catholic nuns took charge of St. Vincent's Orphan Asylum in Philadelphia, they found that of the 27 children in the orphanage, 13 were suffering from a skin disease all over the whole body. The children had no clothes for a change and only one suit which they wore. I could actually keep going. There are a lot of these stories when it comes to these orphanages, but the point is that these were not nice places to be. If they had so much money to build these massive structures, right? I mean, look at some of these orphan asylums. They are very wealthy people who built these structures. So if the story is as they tell us, and they built these structures, why do they not have enough money to properly take care of the orphans? I mean, they basically got rid of orphanages in the modern day. I mean, just think about it. Why do they have so many orphanages back then and they're basically non-existent now? Does that make any sense? This wasn't limited to just the United States, as you see these all over Europe as well. There was this need to begin to move massive amounts of people to new locations, possibly for the purpose of causing identity crisis so that they would never know of their true history. We need to realize that these asylum buildings were also orphanages. That's why when you type in orphan asylums, you see the exact same structures. Not only were these mental institutions, but all of a sudden, out of nowhere, there was this rise in orphans. I really don't buy the mainstream story because many of these orphans were taken advantage of and put to work. So there's so much to this beyond just the stolen buildings aspect, but it's strange, right? Why the need to combine asylums and orphanages? I found this article called The Victorian Orphan Asylums, The Real Story, that spoke about how many of these orphanages were owned by wealthy donors who would donate in an effort to receive good publicity. The writer looks at old newspapers such as the Illustrated London News and discovers that they published articles in 1850 portraying asylum activities as fun and joyous, showing fireworks as if everyone was having a fun time, yet the real conditions in the background were the orphans were not getting fed and many were suffering from sickness. I was looking at some of these old photos and I started to see a trend with what's called colored orphanages. There's this engraving talking about how there were riots in New York at a colored orphanage, and the story is that this was a mob of around 1,000 people who decided to go and destroy this orphanage and everything in it, including the children's clothes. And I saw this article talking about this for Black History Month, and they were looking at this from a negative light, as if these people came in and destroyed this charitable organization that was doing a good deed, but I suspect that something else was going on at these orphanages, and some of the remaining survivors of the old world started realizing this, and so they fought back. Of course, the media covered this only from the perspective that benefited their sponsors, but as I kept looking, I realized that these colored orphanages were a big deal. And this is what was called the Colored Orphan Asylum, which was started in 1836 in New York, just around this period of the reset. So here we go again, we have the orphan asylum connection along with the old world buildings. Except in this case, we have this focused on the Black population. Of course, the mainstream explanation is that this has to do with slavery and that these children's parents weren't able to take care of them, but I mean, look at this building. How many orphans did they have, and why was this considered to be an asylum as well? It's because it was a reprogramming center, and there were multiple of these. The specific one was supposedly rebuilt as well. Now, this colored orphan asylum was run by white Quakers, I believe, but not all of them were like this. And the Quakers actually started another one called the Thomas Asylum for Orphans and Destitute Indian Children. There's the Howard Colored Orphan Asylum, which was led by African Americans and has a very similar story. I know that many of these organizations seem to have good intentions, but I'm just questionable. I mean, look at some of these old newspapers. They were overcrowded and they wanted to make sure that they were good citizens. I don't know, this just seems super suspicious to me. And why are they called asylums? Mental training facilities. There's also the John Hopkins Colored Orphanage, and look at this place, it's another freaking castle. These are what they call orphan asylums, and I just think it's weird that they have these specifically for colored peoples. I should mention that I've seen several photos with white children at these facilities as well, so not sure how strict they are with it being just black children, but they really had these colored orphanages in every major city. Some of the buildings are not as large as the main orphan asylum buildings, but they had this for every race, and since there were so many blacks in America due to them being here already, they needed orphanages specifically for colored peoples. There were also facilities for the Native American tribes, and mainstream history is pretty open about those being re-education camps designed to separate them from their families and traditions, so who's to say that all facilities such as those weren't teaching the same exact stuff? So now that we made the connection with orphanages and asylums, we can now look to see when this all got started, and this is when we get into foundlings. Because before all these orphanages, it really started with the foundlings, and these I believe were some of the first from the old world to be moved around in the old world European cities. So you had these first orphanages being called foundling hospitals, and they were the institutions funded by the Catholic Church for the reception of foundlings, or children who had been abandoned and or taken from couples who were not married. These started to appear all over Europe in the early 1700s in Austria, Belgium, France, England, Scotland, Ireland, Italy, and Russia. Why so many children without parents? Was there some event that displaced a large group of people during these times? The Foundling Hospital in London was founded in 1739 by another wealthy philanthropist named Thomas Coram. It was a children's home for the education and maintenance of exposed and deserted young children. What's so weird is the excuse they give us for calling these places hospitals, because these institutions gave hospitality to those less fortunate. Yeah, they gave out so much hospitality while making orphans sleep 4 to a bed and creating a place where disease can thrive, such as smallpox. These were centers of control, not hospitality, and that doesn't even make sense. I think they knew what hospital meant in the 1700s. Interestingly, I was looking at the arms of the hospital and there are some clear Phoenician symbols. The multi-breasted Diana? Why would they need to use ancient symbols of repopulation here? This is a replanting seed operation, and they're telling you. These hospitals, just like Napa State, practice eugenics. They were trying to create the perfect race of humans, so these places were experimental repopulation centers for recently cleared cities. So in 1756, the House of Commons resolved that all children offered should be received, that local receiving places should be appointed all over the country, and that funds should be publicly guaranteed. They then allowed young orphans to be flooded into workplaces all around the country. So, after their reprogramming, they put them to work. This exact same thing happened in the United States during the Industrial Revolution. Child labor was perfectly fine during this time. Some as young as 4 would work long hours in factories in dangerous conditions. Young migrants from Ireland and Germany were put into factories in poor conditions and essentially worked as slaves. It's possible that many of these factories and orphanages were owned by the British, who were then commissioned by the Royal Phoenicians, and they would take over an old world property and begin using these orphans as slaves to use as their own workers. In the Industrial Revolution, most of the children who were workers were orphans and they had no choice to work for food. These children received little to no education. They would work in coal mines from 4 a.m. to 5 p.m., and the young girls would work in match factories, and the harsh chemicals would often cause them to lose their teeth. So, if these orphan asylum hospitals are named hospitals for their hospitality, then why is it that most of these orphans ended up being used in factories during this time? It wasn't until 1938 with the Fair Labor Standards Act that there was limitations placed on child labor. Interestingly, this is right around the time when orphanages started to fizzle away. I guess they lost their ambitions to help the needy once they realized they couldn't be worked any longer. So essentially, it started with these foundling institutions that relocated and placed the children whose parents most likely were associated with the old world in some way, and these children were then put through cleansing or reprogramming, right? And then these orphans went on to become Oddfellows. These Oddfellows were funded by royalty and older secret societies. These Oddfellow orphan Freemasons started creating orphanages in old world buildings in America to begin repopulating newly taken over cities. They would send in orphans via the orphan trains. This is in the official history. Between the period of 1854 to 1929, over 300,000 children were transported from New York to the Midwest over a 75-year period in the largest mass migration of children in American history. As many of 25% of these orphans were Irish, interestingly. So don't get it twisted, this was an operation. This was no philanthropic pursuit, this was planned and coordinated. Quote, in the 1870s, the Catholic Church became concerned that many Catholic children were being sent to Protestant homes and were being inculcated with Protestant values. They began operating their own placing out program via the railroad sponsored by the New York Foundling Hospital. Quote, many children fell through the cracks. They were mistreated, malnourished, and overworked, says writer and researcher Marilyn Holt, author of the book The Orphan Trains Placing Out in America. Quote, on the other hand, for at least half, it was a good experience. They had opportunities that they would not have if they stayed where they were. They may not have even survived childhood. End quote. Now, when she says they had opportunities, I think what she really means is that they actually had a chance to join the orphan club, or, like the Oddfellows, had connections with the higher-ups or local officials that then gave them better positions. For the vast majority, this was not the case, but they like to mention that they did get some opportunities, as if this was representative of most of these orphans. Their opportunities were to be worked or starved for most of them. Today, it is said that over 2 million Americans are descended from orphan train riders. It could be even more than that. They used these old world train technologies to traffic vast amount of newly programmed orphans into these cities. This happened in almost every major city in America. According to the official narrative, quote, the co-founders of the orphan train movement claimed that these children were orphaned, abandoned, abused, or homeless, but this was not always true. There were mostly the children of new immigrants and the children of the poor and destitute families living in these cities. Criticisms include ineffective screening of caretakers, insufficient follow-ups on placements, and that many children were used as strictly slave farm labor. End quote. Shouldn't that make us question all of these orphanages and asylums? 3 charitable institutions, Children's Village, founded 1851 by 24 philanthropists, the Children Aid Society, established 1853 by Charles Loring Brace, New York Foundling Hospital are some of the organizations behind these orphan trains. This was funded by wealthy donors who had no interest in caring for these children. I thought this was weird when I saw this in the criticism section on Wikipedia. Quote, many children lost their identity through forced name changes and repeated moves. In 1996, Alice Allier said, quote, I was one of the luckier ones because I knew my heritage. They took away the identity of the younger writers by not allowing contact with the past, end quote. So they lost their identity and were given completely new names. So just think about that, because they don't really mention this clearly when you first look into this. Over 300,000 people essentially got their histories erased and were placed into brand new cities. This is exactly what they wanted, identity crisis, so that we would have no idea who we were in the past. And look at this, quote, all orphan train children were true orphans, but were made into orphans by forced removal from their biological families to be placed out in other states. Some claim this was a deliberate pattern intended to break up immigrant Catholic families. Some abolitionists opposed placements of children with Western families, viewing indentureship as a form of slavery, end quote. The Children's Aid Society's 6th annual report is a random sample of Children's Aid Society placements made between 1854 and 1890 indicated that 72% of all children placed had at least one living parent. These records also indicate that adult relatives frequently accompanied children on the orphan trains. Basically, they weren't even orphans, they were taken from their parents and relocated by force. Quote, orphan trains were the target of lawsuits, generally filed by parents seeking to reclaim their children. Right? So they don't really tell us the full story about these orphanages. They're not mentioning that, oh, we actually took these children from their parents. So there's something definitely else going on when it comes to asylums, prisons, orphanages, or foundling hospitals all around this time of the 1800-1812 period, where you start to have these reset ghost cities. And it really makes you think if this was an underground operation that they leave out of the history books, and the purpose was to repopulate recently conquered old world cities with brand new reprogrammed orphans ready for reset with no memories of the past generation. You see, many people are curious as to how could such a history be hidden from us, but if you consider the orphan trains, it makes sense that the first people placed in these cities were orphans who had no idea of their past, so why would they even question the buildings? Their owners could have just gave them a different explanation at the time, and like I said, I think that the very first group of orphans into a city are actually like the prized choiced ones. They are the ones selected to be odd fellows and control the next batch of orphans who come in. So they probably know a little bit and they were given more opportunities in the starting of the city, but they too themselves probably know little of what happened. That secret is known by the royal Phoenician families and other secret organizations who most likely have never revealed their name. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed these last two, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Tell your friends about us if you can, and go check out the entire Tartaria Explained playlist. It's getting pretty big, it's almost 10 parts now, so there's a lot compiled at this point. But what do you guys think? Is there something going on with these asylums, prisons, and orphanages? What do you make of these ghost cities and orphan trains? Stay curious, and all we can hope is that our minds may be unveiled.
Let go of everything you think to be true. Relax the mind and ask the question, do I truly understand what this reality is?